This is Bitnar Talks, the engineer takes on construction. Episode 22. Hi, I'm Piotr Bitnar. Each day I help my clients plan and design building projects through Bitnar Limited, a consulting chartered structural engineer's practice. My biggest passion and the cornerstone on which I've built my business is finding clever solutions for construction projects. I am a chartered structural engineer and a budding software developer, so you can rest assured that I will strive to talk about the best practices and the use of new technologies in the industry. And if you're embarking on a construction project or are involved in planning, designing and building the world around us, you'll find this podcast useful. Approved Document F, Ventilation Volume 1 and Volume 2. Hi, and welcome to Bitnar Talks, your favorite podcast on all matters of architecture, engineering and construction. It is Friday the 28th of June 2024, and I am here back with you with the 22nd episode and information on Approved Document F, Ventilation Volume 1 and Volume 2. Before we dive deep into this week's episode, let us recap the last episode for reference. Last week, I talked about the approved document D and E, toxic substances and resistance to sound. To recap quickly, requirement D1 is all about cavity insulation and potential of insulation polluting the indoor air by off-gassing of urea formaldehyde. Approved document E, resistance to the passage of sound is with 4 requirements and regulation 41. Requirement E1 deals with sound from other parts of the building and adjoining buildings. It basically sets the design must provide reasonable resistance to sound from adjacent parts of the building and adjoining buildings. Requirement E2 deals with sound within a dwelling house. It says internal walls and floors must resist sound transmission, particularly between bedrooms and living rooms. Requirement E3 deals with reverberation in common internal parts. We need to prevent excessive reverberation in common areas like corridors and stairwells in residential buildings. Requirement E4 then goes on to deal with acoustic conditions in schools. Well, it actually does not really, as it references us to follow standards set by the Education Act 1996 and Department for Education. Regulation 41 deals with sound insulation testing. It tells us that the sound performance testing is required for new buildings and certain material changes, with results submitted to building control. Some exemptions apply if using robust details being approved methods. In this episode, I will move to the approved document F and the consideration for ventilation in dwellings and buildings other than dwellings. So without further ado, let's dive into the text of the approved document F. In this episode, I will talk about the statutory guidance contained within the approved document F, ventilation. The episode will follow its standard format for the material talking about the approved documents. I will first read you the text of the actual regulation, and then we'll go section by section, giving a little bit of a commentary or including ancillary information where appropriate. Well, knowing me, it may be inappropriate information from time to time. But don't worry, most of it is a good information. Anyway, the document consists of 2 volumes. Volume 1 deals with dwellings and Volume 2 with buildings other than dwellings. Both volumes deal with the requirements through 5 sections, sections 0 to 4, and reference regulation 39 and 44. The Volume 1 adds regulation 42. Regulation 39 puts an obligation on the provision of information regarding the ventilation system and its maintenance. Regulation 42 puts an obligation on testing of the mechanical ventilation efficiency in the new dwellings, so-called airflow rate testing. And Regulation 44 puts obligation on notification of commissioning of the mechanical ventilation system to the appropriate building control authority, unless the work carried out cannot be tested. I think we got a flavor of the topic now, so let's get into the nitty-gritty of the approved document. So starting with the text of the legislation. Part F, ventilations, means of ventilation. Requirement F1, point 1. There shall be adequate means of ventilation provided for people in the building. Point 2. Fixed systems for mechanical ventilation and any associated controls must be commissioned by testing and adjusting as necessary to secure that the objective referred to in subparagraph 1 is met. Requirement F1 does not apply to a building or space within a building: A. into which people do not normally go, B. which is used solely for storage, or C. which is garage used solely in connection with a single dwelling. So simple reading that is followed by a wide interpretation as usual. In the gist, the air within the dwelling needs to be refreshed and cleaned of vapor and pollutants. Internally generated vapor and pollutants need to be removed and the exterior pollutants infiltration minimized. This generally means a provision of trickle ventilation, mechanical ventilation in the rooms where vapor and pollutants are released, and purge ventilation throughout. Starting with section 0, which eases us into the document, its structure and understanding, we are straight up being told that the volume 1 is for dwellings, and that dwellings means self-contained units, no sharing toilets or kitchen anyone. There are a number of circumstances where the requirement F does not apply, including Schedule 2 buildings, crown buildings, statutory undertakers and airports, certain small additions, police, and some small building extensions. There are naturally expectation rules, some certain rules and limits applicable to all these cases, as may be the case with historical buildings too. Note that emergency repair work does not need to be notified prior to work taking place, and some minor works do not require notification also. But in any case, requirement needs to be met. As ever, the interpretation of the requirement contained within this document may interact with other requirements, and in such case, the higher expectation guidance should be followed. Section 1 informs us of the required ventilation rates in the situation of reasonable external air quality. It is important to provide the right level of ventilation, but equally so to maintain a habitable level of noise within the dwellings, and this point concerns the ventilation units itself, the ducting, but also the noise outside. The levels should be low, at 30 decibels for noise-sensitive rooms and 45 decibels for less noise-sensitive rooms, measured to BS 8233 standard or BS EN 13141 in case of HVAC systems. There is no point of having a system that cannot be maintained, but the requirement may voice the need to provide sufficient access for maintenance. So we are safe and sound on this occasion, aren't we? Typically, the ventilation will be provided by targeted extraction of the air from kitchens, bathrooms and utility rooms, or any other room where elevated level of pollutants or water vapor can be present. Whole dwelling ventilation and purge ventilation needs to be provided as and when needed. All types can be provided by natural means, using stack effects, mechanical means, or a mixture of both. Departures from the guidance can be made just as long as the performance is justified. The performance criteria of pollutants and moisture concentration are given in Appendix B of the document, but the guidance goes as far as prescribing the performance of ventilation system which correlates with the achievable air quality standards. Background ventilators standard references equivalent area in millimeters squared and requires conspicuous marking of the figure on the ventilator itself for verification purposes. Extract ventilation is required in all typical circumstances like kitchens, bathrooms, utility rooms and sanitary accommodation. The performance is given in liters per second. Air are different for continuous system and that for intermittent system, and should generally be fitted at the highest point but not lower than 400 millimeters below the ceiling. This does not include cooker hood, which should be generally installed to manufacturer specifications or between 60 to 75 centimeters over the hob surface. Typical requirements for ventilations of kitchens is either 60 liters per second if there's no cooker hood, or recirculation filter hood used in the kitchen. Then we need to use an extractor with 30 liters per second capacity when extracted to the outside, down to 30 liters per second for continuous ventilation. Utility rooms should either go by 30 or 8 liters per second, bathrooms 15 or 8, and sanitary accommodation one figure of 6 liters per second or purge. Otherwise, the dwelling should be supplied with air by either supply fans or background ventilators at the minimum of 0.3 liter per meter squared of internal floor area, or minimum rate for the number of rooms starting at 13 liters per second for studio apartments to 43 liters per second for a 5-bedroom unit, plus 6 liters per second for every additional room. So calculate either by meter squared or by prescription of bedrooms, whichever is greater. That's the requirement for air ventilation. To allow for the air circulation, doors should be undercut by minimum of 10 millimeters when there are finishes on the floor. When there's no finishes on the floor, it should be 20 millimeters to allow for the finishing to be put at a later date. Purge ventilation is required for all habitable rooms, allowing 4 air changes per hour, but may need to be greater. The window or door opening needs to be at least 1/20th of the floor area if openable to 30% or more, and below that range of the opening it needs to be at least 1/10 of the floor area. Naturally, a mechanical option is always on hand if we need it. We are directed by the guidance to BSEN 13141 for determination of performance of the components of the system we intend to use. The requirement assumes the background ventilation remains open and that we can control the ventilation either manually or automatically, and that the background ventilation is at least 1.7 meters above the floor level to reduce cold drafts, but not too high to inhibit manual operation. Basements may require additional consideration depending whether they are connected to the house and allow continuity of ventilation or not, as well depending on the number of exposed facades of that basement. In any case, the basement may be treated as a single dwelling above the ground, with a consideration for ventilation of at least one room, even if there are no habitable rooms in that basement whatsoever. Mechanical ventilation may be required. Ventilation of inner rooms can be done through other room, through permanent opening between the room of at least 1/20th of combined area of the rooms, taken that the equivalent purge ventilation is possible in the access room, or the room is serviced by 10,000 millimeters square of equivalent background ventilation. Depending on the system of ventilation we choose for our dwelling, the requirement will follow different levels of performance. For less airtight dwellings, we can follow requirements for natural ventilation, and for all dwellings, either continuous mechanical extract ventilation, including natural background ventilation, or mechanical ventilation with heat recovery, That means no natural background ventilation. What is the less airtight dwelling, you ask? It is a dwelling that leaks air more than 5 meter cube per hour per meter squared at 50 pascals of pressure as designed, or 3 meter cubed as built. For highly airtight dwellings, mechanical ventilation may be the only solution. Depending on the ventilation approach, you will take the different limits of ventilation minimums which are prescribed by the guidance. Certain situations may require bespoke specifications and specialist input. It goes without saying that the installation needs to be done to appropriate standards and commissioned in accordance with an approved procedure. You will find a completion checklist and commissioning sheet with the Appendix C of this approved document. This information should be completed by the installer. Section 2 now deals with ingress of external pollutants, which needs to be kept to a minimum, well, at least within the boundaries of the Air Quality Standard Regulations 2010. The sources of pollution will vary from being next to the street, close to exhaust of combustion from other dwelling, construction sites, or any other example. The table showing typical pollutants, exposure limit and exposure time is included within the guidance. For the best solution, we will need to consider the location of the building, type of pollutant, inlets and outlets positions, prevailing winds, and so on. The provision of mechanical and filtered solutions may be the ultimate answer in the worst case scenario, but no mention of such is given within the guidance. When it comes to the relative humidity, we talk about the measurements taken during colder months, and the limit for a new dwelling house is between 65% relative humidity at 1 month's average to 75% at week's average and 85% at day's average. For existing buildings, measurements at the internal face of the external wall should show the surface water activity levels at the same time intervals at 0.75 or 0.85 or 0.95 respectively. This parameter allows determination of condition for mold growth in the wall by checking if the material is rather drying or rather getting more moisture that molds needs to grow. Section 3 refers to work on existing dwellings which should not change the building for worse, but try to improve the quality wherever and whenever possible. So for change of use, we look into upgrading to the standard. As well, when we create new rooms, we ought to be in line with the standard. Now, making changes or otherwise improving on the envelope of the building may inadvertently bring the ventilation level of the building to levels below the required by standard. Remember, we need to get rid of bad air, but bring some good air within, and any improvement very often seal the envelope, inhibiting that access, that trickle of air to within. Guidance comes to aid with simple methods to assess the impact of improvement and gives us a checklist in Appendix D for the identification of possible requirements for bringing the property in line with the regulations. The checklist will likely go over and above the expectations of the regulation, but it's very handy and a starting point to consider. Replacement of windows should ensure sufficient background ventilation, at least matching the one in existing windows, but preferably that of a guidance or as close to the requirement as possible. Addition of rooms, bathrooms, wet rooms will have standard repercussions, requiring the provision of enough ventilation, but refurbishment to these rooms will not automatically trigger such requirements, and if we are using the existing cabling, we will not need to inform the building control of the work. Section 4 goes on to talk about the requirement F1.2, the regulations 39, 42 and 44. The system needs commissioning and testing and recording according to standard procedures. That's it, end of story. Although the document goes on to describe the inspection standards for background ventilators and intermittent extract ventilation, ducted system, airflow rate test of all extract fans, cooker hoods, continuous extract and supply fans and all terminals, controls of the systems too. The commissioning should end up with the preparation of operating and maintenance instruction transferred to the building owner, together with the complete commissioning sheet. The manual should suggest cleaning and maintenance intervals and all the ancillary information that can assist in the operation and maintenance of the system. Some of the information should end up in the home user guide for new dwellings, treating on the system in layman's terms. Now off to Volume 2 and consideration for ventilation in buildings other than dwellings. Section 0 of the document and the text of the legislation remain the same for both volumes, so I will head straight to the In the Gist section of the episode and follow section 1 to 4 with a sneak peek into appendices. So in the gist, the Secretary of State considers the requirement fulfilled when the high water vapor or polluting rooms are well ventilated. Occupants of the building can enjoy minimum levels of outdoor air supply and are given an option for purge ventilation of occupied rooms and sanitary accommodation. Some occupiable rooms may need air quality monitoring. The entry of external pollutants should be minimized, and as ever, the system should be serviceable and maintainable and not to be too noisy or allow for drafts or ingress of rain or be risky to health. Section 1 lays down the provisions for ventilation in different types of buildings, be it specific types of occupiable rooms, offices, car parks, and others not offices and car parks. It's all about the pesky mold that can come about from too much vapor or pollutants, which can be wide on the spectrum, from stinky socks through flu to carbon monoxide. The ventilation system should be designed and done properly to avoid noisy scenarios and to allow due maintenance and service. Ventilation generally follows the principles of extraction, supply of fresh air, purge ventilation, and monitoring of indoor quality. Requirement can be achieved by means of natural or mechanical ventilation, but should we choose to go the natural route, the guidance refers us to the Chartered Institution of Building Services Engineers Applications Manual 10 and Manual 13. The consideration of performance level of the system are stated in Appendix B and include considerations of bioeffluents as well as such measurements of exposure limits for carbon monoxide, nitrogen dioxide, formaldehyde, total volatile organic compounds, and ozone. Printers. We are also guided to use CO2 monitors to verify the efficiency of ventilation in the given room. Naturally, the approach will vary from room to room and may not always give right reading, but for offices and where people breathe a lot, being under 400 parts per million is considered a well-ventilated space, and reading over 1500 parts per minute will require improvement. Again, here the installation of the system needs to be good and needs to pass the commissioning stage. The rooms that will need the monitoring of their air quality will be offices, walk-in fridges, assembly rooms, restaurants, concert halls, and on and on. Basically, wherever people spend their time and or congregate, those are the rooms where monitorings will be needed. Preferable method of monitoring is by non-dispersive infrared CO2 monitors. But there are exceptions. Rooms that are small or large, and the small room is considered that of the volume of 125 meter cubed or 50 square meters of floor area, and the large rooms are considered to be of over 800 meter cubed volume or 320 meters squared floor area. and these do not fall under the remit of monitoring. Extract ventilation in offices should be provided in typical places of heightened pollution, sanitary accommodation, bathrooms, washrooms, food and beverage prep areas, and printer rooms. Printer rooms should be created for heavy use of printers, which means at least 30 minutes per hour, and serviced with extraction of 20 liters of air per second per machine, and the whole building ventilation rate should be met. Sanitary accommodation and bathrooms should have an intermittent air extraction at the following limits of 15 liters per second per shower or bath, and 6 liters per second per WC pan or urinal. However, the sanitary accommodation extraction should have an option to work continuously. Rules for remote kitchens are similar to that of domestic kitchens, with a 15 liters per second requirement if microwave and kettle are in use only. The rooms without openable windows should have extraction working at the time of use and minimum of 50 minutes thereafter. Naturally, specialist buildings and commercial kitchens will follow their own requirements. The requirement of as high as possible but not lower than 400 millimeters from the ceiling ventilators for naturally vented premises is also applicable here, but the passive stack ventilation terminals should be in the ceiling. Air supply for offices should be at least 10 liters per second per person, or 1 liter per second per meter square of floor area. Common areas in the office will need half a liter per second per meter square of the common area, or natural ventilation opening of at least 2% of the floor area. In more complicated scenarios of higher levels of pollutants, the document refers to CIBSZ Guide A, Environmental Design. Purge ventilation is a must for all offices, and ventilation should be controlled either manually or automatically. System generally should not recirculate air into other rooms unless it does so through UVC germicidal irradiation system or HEPA filters. When it comes to car parks, the onus is to limit carbon monoxide concentration to maximum levels of 30 parts per meter in 8-hour period, or 90 parts per meter in 50-minute period at ramps and exits. For naturally ventilated car parks, each level needs to have an equivalent area opening of 5% of the total floor area at that level, with the opposite side receiving at least 1.25% of area each. For car parks with mechanical ventilation, the opening can be reduced to 2.5%, with ventilation capable to deliver 3 air changes per hour, with the caveat for exit and ramps where cars can queue, where the performance should be increased to 10 air changes per hour. Or the ventilation will need to be capable of 6 air changes per hour in general, and 10 air changes at the position of car queuing up. It would be unnatural for the guidance not to refer us for further information to CIBSE, HSE, APEA, and ASHRAE guidances. For other buildings, we are generally referring to CIBSE Guide A and to a 2-page long table describing type of the room and expected performance of ventilation system, or reference to further guidance. Things like for prisons. Go with the Ministry of Justice publication PSI 17-2012, Certified Prisoner Accommodation. Or schools and education will go with Education School Premises Regulation 1999, amongst others. Section 2, minimizing the ingress of external pollutant, is verbatim to that of dwelling, so I will not go through this here again. Section 3, work on existing buildings, follows the logic of the dwellings, but without consideration of typical dwelling-like buildings, and like additions of habitable rooms or conservatories. Section 4, is also similar but without Regulation 42 and regards commissioning and providing information. The commissioning process is required to be according to CIBSE Commissioning Code M, with additional guidance from BESI for ductwork and form part of the energy consumption assessment for Part L requirements, and done together on one form. The information on the system should be provided in the building logbook and the copy of the commissioning sheet handed over to the building owner. So this is it, folks, the approved document F Ventilation Volume 1 and 2. Let's sum it up. So generally speaking, building must have adequate means of ventilation for occupants. Mechanical ventilation systems must be commissioned to ensure they meet the required objectives. Exemptions include spaces where people do not normally go. Buildings used solely for storage and gadgets for single dwellings are generally exempt. Volume 1 deals with dwellings and goes on for 5 sections. Section 0, when it applies to Volume 1, it applies to self-contained dwellings, meaning units with no shared kitchens or bathrooms. Certain buildings, including historical structures and small extensions, can have specific exemptions or additional considerations. Emergency repair work and minor works may not need prior notification, but must still meet the requirements. Section 1 of that volume that deals with ventilation provisions ensure adequate ventilation while maintaining low noise levels of 30 decibels for sensitive rooms and 45 decibels for other rooms. Extract ventilations is generally required in kitchens, bathrooms, utility rooms and sanitary accommodations. Minimum ventilation rates are specified for different types of rooms and scenarios. Purge ventilation should enable 4 air changes per hour with specific window or door opening requirements. Mechanical and natural ventilation methods are addressed with different requirements based on the building's air tightness. Section 2 of the volume, external pollutants, tells us to minimize ingress of external pollutants within the boundaries of the Air Quality Standard Regulation 2010. It tells us to consider location, pollution type, inlets, outlets, and prevailing winds, to name a few. Relative humidity limits are specified to control mold growth. Section 3 of that volume, dealing with existing dwellings, tells us that any changes should improve ventilation quality wherever possible. Guidance includes assessing the impact of improvements and providing checklists for compliance. Replacement windows should maintain or improve existing ventilation levels. Section 4 deals with commissioning and information, which tells us that the system needs to be commissioned and tested to standard procedures with results recorded. Inspection standards for various ventilation components are outlined, and operating and maintenance instructions should be provided to the building owner. In Volume 2, which in many cases is very similar to Volume 1, the Section 0 treats about what Secretary of State considers fine by fulfilling the requirements, and it's generally considered that if rooms with high moisture or pollutants are well ventilated, occupants have enough outdoor air supply, and options for purge ventilations are available, that's good enough. The system should also be maintainable, not too noisy, and avoid drafts or rain ingress. Section 1, similar to Volume 1, deals with ventilation provision, different building types, and that's where it differs here, as we have several different building types that we treat a little bit differently. Includes offices and car parks have tailored ventilation requirements. Ventilation should avoid mold and pollutants, be properly designed and allow maintenance. Extract, supply, purge ventilation and indoor air quality monitoring are required for certain rooms. Section 2, external pollutants. This section basically mirrors that for the dwellings, focusing on minimizing the ingress of external pollutants. Section 3, existing buildings. Similar to dwellings, but without consideration typical to homes like habitable rooms or conservatories. Section 4, this is about commission and provision of information, also similar to that of the dwellings, but using different standards for commissioning and reporting. Commissioning should follow CIPSE standards and be part of the energy assessment for Part L. System information should be included in the building logbook and provided to the owner. In the next episode, we will move to approved document G, sanitation, hot water, safety and water efficiency. I hope you enjoyed this episode and that the considerations of the approved document F ventilation is more friendly with you. Now, if you have any questions, reach out to me on LinkedIn or send me an email. I'm more than happy to help you out. In Bitna, we deal with planning, designing and managing of your projects, and we are always glad to facilitate a free initial consultation to steer you in the right direction. Visit www.bitna.co.uk and reach out to us. Whether your question is if we can help you with your project or what should I do, we will be able to give you a piece of non-obligatory advice. At Bitna, we help our clients design and execute their dream homes or investments. If your building is falling apart, we can also help investigate the reasons behind, and to provide you with an appropriate strategy, design and specifications for the repair. Thank you again for listening. Please voice up your opinions. I'm waiting for you on LinkedIn and I want to hear from you. See you next week. Remember, Bitna designs the world around you. Toodaloo!